Hey, how's it? I'm Dan. Welcome back to Breathing Underwater's Moviecast. And yeah, I am well aware of how much background noise there is. Right now, I'm just starting out on like a 4 to 5 hour drive to the beach. It's summertime, summer movie season. But look, here's the thing about having 3 kids, full-time job, pets, house, all the luxuries and responsibilities of middle classness, is it means I can only get to stuff when I have the time. Do I ever have the time for stuff, especially sitting down and concentrating and making stuff? No, not really. So I have to find the time when it presents itself and take advantage of it. So I'm in the car, AC's on, because it's excruciatingly hot out. Got my paddleboard on the top of the car that's probably going to make a lot of vibrating noise. But like I said, I'm going to forge ahead. I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity of time where I would have spent the whole trip thinking about the movie that I saw last night. Now I can just process it verbally. So come along on this verbal vomit ride with us as we delve deep into Indiana Jones and the what was that? Like most people, I was not highly anticipating this movie. I highly anticipated Crystal Skull when it came out, like most Indiana Jones fans, having grown up with the movies. As a kid, I probably watched them, like most people in my generation, a little bit too young, especially for the graphic body horror aspects. But nevertheless, my parents loved them, so they passed that down to us, my brother and I. Though my parents were not big fans of Temple of Doom, so I remember the way that we had watched them. I was too young to have seen them in the theater, but sometime in the early 90s, they used to have these promotions at like Pizza Hut and McDonald's and Burger King. Like I remember at Pizza Hut, when the first Land Before Time came out, you could get like an upgrade to your pizza that came with these like really nice Boglin style hand puppets of all the characters. And then McDonald's was doing a promotion where, you got however many, I don't know, if it was like meals or points or something, you could then just pay a little extra to get a VHS of the Indiana Jones trilogy. So my parents opted to get Raiders and Last Crusade, but they didn't want to have Temple of Doom in the house. I guess they thought it was like too violent or whatever, too dark, like a lot of parents did, hence the PG-13 rating that was newly given at the time. But yeah, Indiana Jones was up there with me with Star Wars and Ghostbusters and Back to the Future, Jurassic Park, one of those foundational franchises that helped shape my love and appreciation of film and filmmaking. And I was pretty fresh out of film school where I studied screenwriting, which you can hear a lot more about on a recent episode of this podcast where I sat down with a current screenwriting student and compare and contrast at our time at writing school. But yeah, I was just a couple years removed, still very fresh out of a screenwriting program for my undergraduate when Crystal Skull came out. And again, because Indiana Jones was so formative for me, I was really excited about the whole team getting back together to make a new installment, like we all were. But needless to say, I only saw it that one time in the theater, and I barely made it through the thing. Now, I hear a lot of people comparing the two. Of course they will, especially because they're the later installments with the older Harrison Ford era of Indiana Jones, comparing Crystal Skull and Dial of Destiny. Seems like the consensus generally is that Destiny is a little bit better of a movie overall and people enjoyed it more. And I can't believe I'm saying this. And again, I haven't seen Crystal Skull since it came out, so all I know are like the memories and the clips and YouTube videos breaking it down that I've seen since. But from what I remember, that one actually felt more like an Indiana Jones movie to me overall. Before we really get into everything, as usual, this isn't a normal review. I don't really do that kind of thing. If you're interested in more of just like my knee-jerk reactions to stuff, I do a lot of shorts on YouTube and reels on Instagram and TikTok and stuff about that. You can find all that information at breathingunderwater.us. But really what struck me about this movie, having just seen it, compared to all the other Indiana Jones movies, was the quality and the focus of the writing. And that's really what I want to get into in this episode. When it comes to just the review and my reaction part, I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Suffice it to say, I generally agree with most people's reactions out there, the realist ones at least, where like it's not bad by any means, it's well put together. It was mildly entertaining, I guess, but I just had a lot of issues with basically every layer of it beyond it just being like a competent film. Though I don't think it ever sunk to the lows of Crystal Skull, at least Crystal Skull took some big swings, like when Shia LaBeouf was swinging through the jungle with monkeys. It definitely all didn't land by any means. But watching this thing, I was finding myself thinking about all the other Indiana Jones movies, including Crystal Skull, and just yearning for more bombastic bombastic over-the-topness. This one just played it really straight, really kind of down the middle. It didn't really go for anything that made it feel worthy of the Indiana Jones moniker, or to, resurrect that character for one more go. And what I want to do more than just give my reactions and criticisms about the movie is look at what it was and how it could have been better, like just little tweaks or additions that they could have made. Not total rewrites, but just enhancements to what was already there. How this just could have been a better experience overall, in my humble opinion. A class that I took in college where we had to watch some movies and read some scripts and then do a new draft, kind of be story doctors and fix the present issues based on what we understood about story and structure and character and themes and all that kind of stuff. And ever since then, every time I see something, especially something that I want to be good, and I want everything to be good when I go spend the time and money and energy, especially like I said, of how busy and how little time I do have to devote to, frivolous things, as it were. Most of the time, I don't walk out of a movie or stop a TV show and just say, well, that was awful and I hated it, and just leave it at that. I always have that script rewrite, what if this movie had had another draft kind of mentality. I like to kind of dissect it, look at the pieces, and put it back together in my mind of like what I would do if I was given that script before it went into production. So that's what we're going to do with Dial of Destiny. So to organize my thoughts a little bit, I'm going to try to look at this from what I think are the 4 main or most important pillars of telling a good story, but also executing a good story for screen, which are plot, characters, themes, and the genre. So let's start with the plot. Honestly, I really didn't have any problem with the plot as it was. The whole quest for the Archimedes dial I thought was right up there with looking for the Lost Ark or looking for the Holy Grail. It was a great MacGuffin-ish kind of plot device that, was a catalyst to bring a diverse cast of characters together to go looking for some kind of treasure, something valuable to more than one person for more than one reason. The perfect catalyst for an Indiana Jones movie. No problems with that. Even the time travel element, as Indy said in the movie, he'd been tortured with voodoo and seen things he couldn't explain, and there was a precedent to explore things outside of just treasure hunting. Of course, that was established in Raiders. The supernatural or the metaphysical is part of this universe, and that's fine. And I still think that the whole alien thing could have worked in Crystal Skull if they had just handled it with a little bit more, reverence and mystique. Treated it with a little bit more kind of X-Files-ish tone, because X-Files can get campy, and trust me, I'm going to do a whole episode on X-Files pretty soon because I'm almost through not just the show and the movies, but the spin-off shows too. But X-Files could get silly and campy and go for more of that B-pulp kind of feel, but it always tried to take its lore seriously. Whereas Crystal Skull started out that way, especially when they brought in, the CIA or the FBI at the beginning to question Jones and stuff, and it did feel a little bit more conspiratorial and a little bit more big picture. But then by the end, it just devolved into just total random nonsense, and a flying saucer flew away, and I don't know, it just didn't quite fit into the mythos. At least I feel that way. But time travel is the same kind of thing. If handled correctly, I think it could have worked. But I think that they just didn't know what to do with it, and we'll get into that in a minute. But for most of the runtime, them just running around, finding clues, and figuring out where the dial was, and the kind of codex thing, and all the misadventures and everything along the way, that felt totally indie to me. But what didn't was the Dan Brown level of treasure hunting and mythos exposition, all the nitty gritty, super drawn out, and sometimes frankly boring dialogue and explaining that they felt they had to do to keep the plot moving. I just did not think was necessary. And if you look back at the other Indiana Jones movies, there's a little bit, like in Raiders at the beginning when he's explaining to the government or military guys about what the Ark is and what it does. But it's really just an overview, and the details aren't as important as just understanding that this thing is important to people, it's dangerous, it's mysterious. It just sets a tone. And even when they're deciphering the symbols on the headpiece for the staff and everything, it's really just kind of minor details that we don't need to fully understand or dissect to keep the plot moving. And I love Dan Brown books. The movies were really a misfire, but that's what this felt more to me, was like a Dan Brown movie with an Indiana Jones veneer over it, because they spent so much of the runtime explaining things to each other and getting into the nitty-gritty of the history and how it all functioned and why. And I don't feel like that was ever really important to Indiana Jones, at least not in the films. I know that there's a lot of extended universe stuff, and there was a Young Indiana Jones show. And even in Crystal Skull, it was always more about the adventure and the spirit. And the forward momentum of the plot was less about the details and more about the action and adventure. So the first big rewrite I would do in my draft of this screenplay is to heavily minimize the exposition and the details. Yes, that stuff is interesting. I was interested in it like in a vacuum. I didn't know that much about Archimedes, and I'm inspired to learn more. But as a narrative, I just thought it really slowed down the pacing and really affected the tone. So I guess that kind of leads me into the next pillar of genre. I feel like the writers of this one didn't quite understand the assignment. It's sort of like with Harry Potter and how JK's original run of books were mysteries at their core. They had a lot of other subgenre stuff going on, little sprinkles of romance and horror and adventure and things, but in general they were character-based mysteries. But then The Cursed Child turned it all on its head, and it made it like a time travel romp, where it was so plot heavy and was all about time paradox crap that it got so bogged down in all that it didn't have time to develop or flesh out all these new characters. At least reading the play, I haven't got to see it on stage, and I still would like to, just to see the difference and see the adaptation of the script. But just having read the Cursed Child script, I feel like that is the same issue with Dial of Destiny, is that they forgot or neglected or intentionally moved away from what made Indiana Jones great in the first place and kept it great even in its lower moments. Like I said, I didn't grow up watching Temple of Doom as much. I saw it a couple times when I was younger and a few times when I was older, and that one just never really stuck with me like the other two, especially because honestly, most of the movie is like nothing happening. They're just traveling around and reacting to situations that they find themselves in, as opposed to being more active like the other two movies where they're actively after something. So I don't feel like Temple of Doom really kind of gets going until like an hour and a half into it. But even then, it was about the tone. The genre understood it was an action adventure. They were on an adventure and there was action along the way, and that's what it was focused around. Dial of Destiny had a lot of action, but it didn't feel like an adventure. First of all, like, Indy didn't even want to do this. There was even that moment where he was talking to Sala when he was dropping him off at the airport, and Sala was kind of giving us a little hope that the tone was going to shift into more of an action-adventure heavy thing, as opposed to, you know, more of like a action character drama. When you have an old, grizzled, dejected, depressed, end of his rope character, like about to retire Indy, and he gets thrust into a situation that he doesn't even want to be in. Even in Temple of Doom, he haphazardly walked into that situation with the magic stones and stuff, but there was this like gravitas and bravado around it with his character. He was so pompous and adventurous in his spirit that he gladly took on that adventure, dove head first into it, as opposed to this where he's just kind of being pulled along to get his name cleared. So it just had a totally different kind of trajectory, especially when it came to the genre. To me, it just didn't feel fun. As opposed to, and like I agree with most sentiment out there about the opening action scene with the train heist, regardless of the de-aging technology. I know that really bothers people and they focus so much on it, and I totally agree on principle that it's just not quite there yet. The uncanny valley is very distracting, but that wasn't the biggest problem of that whole sequence to me. The whole problem of that sequence to me was that it wasn't necessary. It just felt so pandering. They knew that the rest of the movie really wasn't going to feel like an Indiana Jones movie, and that's why, you know, the reaction to this movie has been like, well, it's worth it for at least the first 20 minutes because it feels like Indiana Jones, at least for that. I mean, yeah, that's fine. That's what it was. It felt like its own little short, but that didn't justify the rest of the movie. And to best service the story, that should have been cut out completely The story should have started in the 60s, started with Jones waking up to that rock and roll music, those damn kids. That really did set like a precedent too of how the rest of the movie was going to be. He's just like this grumpy old man yelling out the window at the youngsters. That's fine for a character, but did anybody really want to see Indy like that? This has been talked about to death already, so I don't want to get too much into that. But if the story needed to be what it was, they needed to have the rest of the movie after the beginning be not de-aged, not set in the time that Indy was at his prime, then fine. But don't put in that opening scene just to pander to what people really wanted to see and then just take it away from them. That should have been, in my opinion, just hinted at, or maybe some flashbacks to moments of that whole sequence so we understood the relationships of the characters and the importance of the dial and why Mads Mikkelsen was after it and everything. But honestly, that sequence, not just what happened in it, but the tone and Indy's character felt like old Indiana Jones because it was a big, bombastic romp of an adventure. He was there willingly, and he was passionate about finding that Christ knife, and then the dial came into play. And he was just as passionate about keeping it out of the hands of the Nazis. Now, for the genre, that really just depends on what I was mandated by the studio to do. If I was in Mangold's and Kep's and everybody else's shoes, that if Kathleen Kennedy was no, it has to be about undercutting the value of this beloved character by making him, a grumpy old man just shaking his fists at the world that he doesn't understand, and having it be more about his young, plucky goddaughter who knows just as much as him or more and is more capable in every way, then what I would push back with is, at the very least, what is Indy's motivation to be here? More than just clearing his name or, I guess vaguely looking out for his goddaughter. I'll get more into this when I talk about characters, but it does play into this. Their motivations were clear but undercooked to me. I understood why Indy was doing what he was doing, but to make it more of an Indiana Jones movie, to make it more fun, I don't have any exact or perfect answer, but I would do something that makes him more of a driver of the plot instead of a reactor to it. And it could be something as simple as, instead of his friend, who was Baz, that made him promise to destroy the dial, but he didn't for his, philosophical archaeologist reasons and such. Maybe it was just that his friend knew that the Nazis were still looking for it, or maybe he knew that Mads Mikkelsen, I forget his character name, but maybe he knew that Mads Mikkelsen's character was still looking for it and they, were actively after him. So maybe that's why he was a little bit more on the zanier side and he neglected his daughter, was because he was paranoid. Maybe he detached himself from Helena? Yeah, Helena, right? I don't know. I don't care. Like I said, I'm driving, so I can't Google this stuff right now. But maybe he did that out of, I know it's cliche, but he did it to protect her from what he knew, the Nazis were after. Maybe he had tried to destroy the dial and he couldn't or something. They've used magics before. Why not put a spell on it or a curse or something? I mean, there's so many ways they could have, so many plot devices they could have contrived to explain, why Indy had it and why the Nazis were looking for it. But either way, it could have just been as simple as Indy was entrusted with it. He thought he was protecting his friend. Maybe he didn't even know that his friend had died. I don't know. And then so Helena showing up was a big shock. Not just because he hadn't seen her in a long time, because of his own detachment and apathy or depression or whatever it was. But, maybe he too had made a pact with his friend so that nobody associated with the dial was connected to her, so she would be safe or something like that. But either way, anyway, so he's entrusted with it. The Nazis come looking for it, and he has some specific thing that he needs to do with it to fulfill his original goal. Maybe he was hiding it from the government, and so that could have added that extra thing. I don't know. I thought that was kind of deflating too when you find out that the CIA had teamed up with, former Nazi agents. There was some interesting, almost conspiratorial stuff until you find out that just because Mads Mikkelsen had helped with the space race, that the CIA was just kind of placating him, giving him his reward, so to speak. And then they kind of cut him off after that. So, I don't know, it took away any teeth from anybody else having any kind of stake in this thing. To me, it was interesting because it started out with pretty high stakes. There was this faction of people that were murdering innocent civilians to get to this piece of archaeology that included government agents, American government agents. They were murdering people to get to it, or at least were condoning other people doing that. Then they just kind of let it all go, and they cut Mickelson loose, and it was just like, that's a lowering of the stakes. That's sort of like the antithesis of a screenwriting 101 thing, which is to raise the stakes as the story goes on to get you more and more invested by the third act climax. And people like David Koepp are like very, very seasoned writers. I feel like they really easily should have known better. So maybe Indy is running not just from the Nazis or whatever, but he's also running from our government because everybody's after this thing. Kind of like with the Lost Ark, our government wanted it, the US government wanted it because they knew that Hitler wanted it. They didn't understand how powerful it was, but Hitler had an idea, and then once it was revealed about what it could do, our government locked it away. So there was some, interesting precedent set there of bigger institutions being involved. And especially as a final outing, it would have been cool to have like this almost James Bondy kind of stakes at play. Because maybe the dial was the key to something else, something world-ending that wasn't just one guy figuring out that he could, usurp Hitler in the past and then become the new Hitler. That was also kind of vague and abstract for everybody but him. And on that front, this is more of a plot thing, but I don't feel like they ever really established like how detrimentally important it was that Mickelson didn't get the dial and didn't go fulfill his original plan. They needed something to illustrate what it would have been like if he had become Hitler and, like he said, or circumvented all of Hitler's mistakes and flaws. That's a really interesting idea. That's like the, was that Prime show, Man in the High Castle or something? I only watched a couple episodes, but, if the Nazis had won, what if? That's what he was trying to accomplish, right? It needed at least like in Lord of the Rings with Galadriel letting Frodo look into forgot what it was called now, but whatever, J.K. Rowling got the Pensieve idea from the basin that showed him a possible future, and, it also a little reference to the Scouring of the Shire sequence of the books. It needed something like that, and that's maybe what the beginning could have been, was like an alternate reality or something where, Indy is fighting the Nazis and Mickelson already is the Führer. Then they could have cut back to the present or to the 60s and the, whatever main timeline or something, and show why we were trying to avoid that. It could have been anything, like a dream or a vision or something. And I don't usually like those kind of things to be the sparks that ignite story, like in Return of the Sith. That was one of my biggest gripes about just the story level, because obviously I didn't like anything about any of the other parts of the prequels. But the fact that Anakin's true turn to the dark side was predicated on a Force vision without anything like tangible really bothered me. That's how Darth Vader became Darth Vader. But I digress. So anyway, my next big rewrite would be, if time travel had to be a part of it, time travel would have to be used more effectively. Because by the time we got to the third act, I saw what they were trying to do with like a big plot upset. That was the only real like kind of reveal or plot twist of the movie, was that because of continental drift. Mickelson's whole calculations were off and they went to a different time, and then you find out that it was always going to go back to that time because Archimedes built the dial to get help for the war, right? So that was interesting, but in terms of this story, it felt to me so out of place and just so trite as a time travel thing to just kind of almost arbitrarily, especially at the very end of a story, to take your characters and just throw them into some other complete different reality. There was no time to develop any of that. It was so silly, like seeing these guys after, spending the whole movie first in the 40s and then in the 60s, and now we're all the way back 2,000 years ago, the siege of Syracuse, and it was, they were starting another movie, but without giving it any real setup or allowing there to be any real payoff. It was ridiculous, but not in the fun way to me that Indiana Jones can be ridiculously fun. There was so much going on there in such a short amount of time that to me, it didn't let anything really percolate or settle. They were just rushing from thing to thing. It was like, oh, we're in the wrong time. Oh, we're getting shot at by giant spears. Oh, there's Archimedes. Oh, now Indy wants to stay here. Oh. And it just kept like adding on layers of convolutedness to what was otherwise a very simple story of like cat and mouse and treasure hunting. And again, it felt more like The Cursed Child, where they were just jumping around and all these crazy things were happening and then they would jump somewhere else. If they were going to play with time, they should have done what one of the best franchises of time travel ever did in Back to the Future. And I'm going to reference, I think, most people's least favorite installments, which are 2 and 3, which I agree on principle that they are not as good as 1 overall, but they still make a great trilogy in my mind, because what number 2 does is illustrate what the consequences of number 1 really are. If you go back and change things, there's a butterfly effect. So number 2 gets really deep into the consequences of meddling. And I thought that was a clever place to take the plot and story of something where the time travel was really kind of just a plot device in Back to the Future 1, because Back to the Future 1 was more about the characters and their arcs and what they needed to learn. Back to the Future 2 was more about learning not to mess with time travel. And then Back to the Future 3, again, I know a lot of people don't like that one because it wasn't as much of a time travel romp and it was more of a full-fledged Western, and I love Westerns, so, I'm partial to that. But it let its setting and its characters settle in, and then it took you on a ride within the verisimilitude of that story. So on the time travel front, if I had been writing this, I would have either not gone back in time at all, just had it be more of an abstract idea, and this isn't coming out of the blue, because in Raiders, all the metaphysical stuff happened at the very end, and it was very brief, and it was just organic, natural consequence to character actions, character choices. And it wrapped the plot up nicely. And yeah, if you really look at it, there's a lot of plot holes and stuff with it. How did they know that the Ark was going to have power other than just, what was mentioned biblically and historically? It was kind of vague. But that's not the point. The point is that it was notoriously powerful, so powerful people wanted it. It was the Holy Grail, if I may. And on the Holy Grail front too, none of the supernatural stuff really happened until the very, very end, and all it was just more of a plot device to heal and fix the stakes of Dr. Jones Sr. being shot. They needed to get themselves out of that on a plot level, and so having, the Fountain of Youth made sense. But they didn't dwell on it. Oh, and even in Temple of Doom, in Temple of Doom. Temple of Dune, that would be an interesting movie. The stones, had their desired effect, but the most of the movie wasn't about that effect. It wasn't about the thing itself. And I'm going to give some props to Crystal Skull. The most of the movie wasn't about the aliens and their power and technology or whatever. It was about the search for it. And that's what Indiana Jones established itself to be. That's what it's supposed to be. That's our expectations for the franchise and the genre that it fits into, is the adventure of doing the thing, of looking for the things, and then a small little payoff with whatever the supernatural metaphysical thing that they were after is. I don't know if we'll be able to hear this on the recording, but somebody's got a huge woofer behind me. The whole car is vibrating. That'll make an interesting soundtrack to Indiana Jones podcast. But if I had to include time travel, then I would have had it happen much earlier, maybe by like the midpoint of the movie instead of by the end of the climax. And I would have given it time. I would have given that new setting and the circumstances and the consequences and the stakes of the time travel more time to flesh out and have actual value in the story. So like maybe they do go back and they meet Archimedes and they need his help to get back, kind of like, in Back to the Future. I'm not saying that these are like amazing or super original ideas, but just on a basic story level, I think they would have worked better, especially for this franchise and this action-adventure genre. It's totally fine to play around with old tropes and cliches as long as they fit the story. Just like in superheroes, how many superheroes have lost somebody important to them, and that's why they're a vigilante. It works because it works. Alright, so let's get into the characters and the themes. Because you can have a generic plot, cliche genre tropes, but if you have good solid characters, not even deep three-dimensional characters, but just charismatic, interesting, relatable characters, and something for those characters, some kind of theme for those characters to embody, you can have an entertaining movie. Or at least more entertaining to me than Dial of Destiny. Because if you look especially at the first two Indiana Jones movies, and I would say Crystal Skull too, if I remember the characterization, there wasn't a lot of depth going on. Yeah, like Indy got sad when he thought that Miriam was dead. But in general, like what you see was what you got from these characters. They were kind of characterized a certain way. Like Indy is a brash, gruff, pompous, bigger than life, kind of adventurous, but also highly intelligent, passionate professor and archaeologist, and tough guy, cool guy. He was very brutish and blunt, but also could be very suave. So he had a lot of fun layers to him. He was an engaging character, but he was relatable because he was passionate about what he was doing. It meant something to him. We can all get on board with that. And then he would have plucky sidekicks, and he would have brazen and abrasive love interests, but who could hold their own in their own ways, and bigger than life, also very charismatic villains, femme fatales. There was a gamut of great characters. But I think the reason that Last Crusade resonates more lastingly with a lot of people, especially with me, that was the one, and I've heard this a lot recently from people's retrospectives and reviews of my generation on YouTube, that Last Crusade was probably the most rewatched by a lot of people in my generation, even though Raiders was a lot of our entry point, just because it had a little bit more character depth because of the foil of Indy Sr. Sean Connery was such a perfect antagonistic force for Indy, because he wasn't just some bad guy that he could punch in the face. He was his father, and he knew just how to push his buttons. But that also peeled off some of the deeper layers of Indy and his pain, his neglect as a kid, and we learned a lot about through their dynamic. And I get it that Harrison Ford is elderly, that they don't want to recast because Harrison Ford, they're still banking on him being a draw. And, he's the only one that's ever played the character, at least in the feature films. I understand trying to respect where the actor is at now by creating a story for somebody his age, for the character being that age. That's fine. But what is Hollywood's obsession, especially Lucasfilm, but it's way wider than that, of making all of their aging male protagonists, especially ones that were former iconic heroes, people that kids used to look up to, get inspired by. Why are we in this? We have to deconstruct every one of these heroes. And I know this has been talked about to death online, but I am totally in this camp of there's nothing wrong with telling a story about somebody that is in a different place, a different mindset. They've gone through trauma. They have some reason to be unwilling or reluctant. The reluctant hero, Aragorn, is a perfect example. But Aragorn was never an insufferable, depressed, obnoxiously passive, annoying character that you just wanted to just slap in the face and be like, get over yourself kind of character. You can be a reluctant hero with an arc that brings you back to where you started, or you grow from where you started, or whatever, without sullying the visage of these people. Why does age need to be treated like a disease? Here's another great example. Alec Guinness, Obi-Wan Kenobi. He was elderly. He was a hermit. He was detached from society. He was a loner. He was probably very lonely. But he wasn't sitting around feeling sorry for himself like his counterpart in the Obi-Wan show. Why Ewan McGregor agreed to that script, because he was really the only bright spot in the prequels for a lot of us. Just because his character was actually treated with a little bit of respect. And you could see the progression from the prequels Obi-Wan to the Alec Guinness Obi-Wan. He still was hopeful. He still believed in the power of the Force and its unifying bond, and he was excited to impart that on Luke. Why couldn't Luke be like that? Especially having had the groundwork laid by his mentor, Alec Guinness. Why did Han have to revert back to just being a smuggler in The Force Awakens? There's so many examples of this. It seems that so many more are done poorly and distastefully, as opposed to with grace and reverence for what had come before. But Indy's whole thing was, yes, I guess it was relatable, but it wasn't necessary. It wasn't exciting. It didn't put me in adventurous mode. So like Sala, Sala had been through a lot. He had to immigrate because of what was going on in Northern Africa at the time, but he was still full of a sense of wonder and excitement for what the world had in store for them if they had gone out with a adventurous mindset. So it was even right there in the movie. And even as a character, he obviously didn't love being in New York, but he was grateful for being there and his family being safe and thriving because of Indy's goodwill and generosity. So just because, yes, it's tragic that we all lost Shia LaBeouf, but nobody liked his character anyway. And they didn't spend enough time establishing that bond. See, that's the thing too, is they love to do this in Hollywood where things are one way. And that always bugged me too a lot in Ghostbusters 2 was an early example, but we see it all the time where we leave off with characters where they get together and they're happy and, there's a happily forever after kind of thing. And then the next time we see them in a relationship, the relationship's over, it's been ruined. There's been all this tragedy, and now they're all dejected and old and sad. So all that said, I'm just trying to illustrate how it's really frustrating when all this stuff happens off screen, when Hulk goes from raging, out of control monster to Professor Hulk off screen. But those things are really important to the story and the characters. We've just seen this so many times. It was not necessary to put Indy in that realm, because like I said before, it just set a precedent and a tone for what his character was going to be like. And then by the time we got to the end, when he just wanted to stay, I don't feel like that was set up very well. So on his character front, I saw what they were going for. They were trying to make him a man out of time, out of place, didn't have anything else to live for. So given the opportunity to kind of start over in a way, even though he was bleeding out, and I'm sure that 2,000-year-old medicine, I mean, Helena's character even says so, like, what are you gonna, leeches and bacteria and stuff, whatever she says, like, he totally would have, ate it as soon as she left anyway. For him to feel so fervent about staying that she would need to, like, knock him out. An old man that's been shot, she feels a need to, like, cold cock him, give him a concussion just so she can manhandle him back to his time in New York. Ugh. They could have at least set that up more and set it up more clearly that he really just wanted out. Yes, he was going to retire. His son was dead. Miriam had left, was trying to leave him. But was that really like enough for him to just give up completely? He still had his archaeology. He did have Helena out there. He knew she was alive. He had lots of friends. He had Sala's grandkids. I'm sure he was like a grandfather to them. And, I'm sure he knew Sala's kids that were grown, and I'm sure he had a relationship with them. I mean, there were too many things in place already for them to just put him in that position of just being like, nah, I'm just going to stay here. It was undercooked. But before I get to the character elephant in the room, I want to talk about the little sidekick Teddy. There was potential there for him to be interesting. I mean, the only other thing that we really have to compare him to is Short Round, and Short Round was fine. But again, he fit the Indiana Jones mold, I think, just fine without having to be a super fleshed out character. We didn't need to get a lot of backstory about him. He was so charismatic. He was written so well and acted so well that we got enough characterization from him for him to be entertaining enough in that role. So if you're going to have like a kid sidekick who's, super plucky and, way more advanced for their age than they probably should be. There goes my paddleboard straps on the top of the car buzzing. See how that turns out. At the very least, with this kid Teddy, they could have got an actor and written a role that was more akin to Short Round to just be a little bit over the top, silly, and have some kind of like dynamic with somebody that was more interesting than just kind of being there. That kid, I didn't have anything wrong with his performance as is, but I also didn't gravitate to it at all. It didn't do anything for me. It was just kind of there. He was just like an extra piece of window dressing that gave a tiny bit of insight and relatability into Helena's character. And he was kind of a plot device because he could fly that plane, but they could have easily figured something else out for that. I mean, even Helena could have just been the pilot the whole time. Who cares? But there was an opportunity there, and this is how I would have rewritten him, is you had this established issue with Shia LaBeouf not coming back, obviously. We have this whole thing about Indy being depressed because of the tragedy and loss that he's suffered, and that's supposed to be justification for his choices throughout the movie, especially at the end. And yet we didn't get to see any of that. None of that was set up on screen. The time that he spent in Crystal Skull with Mutt, from what I can remember, was all plot for the most part. They had some interactions, they had some snarky banter, but what bond did he really form with Mutt that was more substantial, that could have informed Indy's characterization in this movie? It was all just exposition about, I lost my son in Vietnam, but we never even knew that he cared about his son, because he didn't even know he had a son until he was an adult. What was the relationship like? Well, show us through Teddy. He's pulled into the situation with this kid the son, who was younger than his son before he met him. Also, they set the seeds with him not being there for Helena after her dad died. So there's some kind of selfish, detached thing going on there that was never really addressed or resolved. That was minorly addressed as sort of like a snarky one-off by Helena. God, I'm going to keep saying it wrong. Just bear with me. All I can hear in my head is Tommy Boy is like, that's nice. You look like a Helen. When she chides him for, her dad dying and then not having any other possible father figure that's already put in place that could have looked out for her. Like, I agreed with her that's kind of messed up, that Indy agreed to be in that role, but they didn't do anything with it. That could have been some interesting character stuff. So, Indy dropped the ball with his own kid, dropped the ball with his goddaughter, and then has this new kid pulled into the story who doesn't have any parents, who's being guided, brought up by Helena, who's obviously a problematic parental figure for him. That could have been a great foil for insight into Indy's tortured soul over the lost opportunity that he had with his own kid and goddaughter, and maybe trying to right that wrong, like giving some advice, having some quiet moments with Teddy. There could have been something there. There was something there that they put there. It was right in front of you. And this is the thing that really bugs me when I see movies and I'm like, it's not even when they're bad and like the stuff isn't even there to that it could have been good. It's when it's all right there and it feels like they just didn't give it the script enough time. They didn't give it enough drafts. And that's the most frustrating part, is when things could have been good. And that's so common in Hollywood right now. So that really bugged me about that character, that he was just kind of a non-character. He was a plot device for the most part. He was fine, but he was kind of nothing in the end. Still, before I get to the Helena-sized elephant in the room, I just want to mention Mads Mikkelsen again. I love Mads Mikkelsen, like most people do. He's an amazing actor, and he brings a really great, sinister, just off-puttingness to his roles, especially when he plays villains. But I feel like he was another missed opportunity, especially in context of Indiana Jones and the genre and the kind of villains that we've seen in Indiana Jones movies. Even in Crystal Skull, we had people like Cate Blanchett, who was really hamming it up. She was a lot of fun, even though I didn't like her as a character, but she fit the mold of what a good indie villain is, which is just like a big, evil, over-the-top. Like Belloc in Raiders was so much fun. He was horrible. And that's what made his character so much fun for Indy to go up against. But Mikkelsen was just given, just like in The Secrets of Dumbledore, he was given like nothing to work with. He was, and I thought it was, they were trying to do something with him being overly polite, because he wasn't a Führer type. He was just a scientist that, was looking at everything very practically and pragmatically. That was interesting, but he had no personality. There was nothing for anybody to bounce off of. He wasn't, like yelly, shouty, bigger than life, like, go get them or I'll kill you kind of bad guy. He wasn't like Belloc, where you could, wondering if he was kind of playing both sides, but he was really just having fun. And he didn't really care about Mariam. Wow, what am I? He was just in it for the glee. Mads Mikkelsen just deserved a better script to work with, because he could have been a fantastic indie villain, as evidenced by Casino Royale. He was so good in that. He's one of those actors, kind of like Gosling. He underplays things sometimes on purpose. I think that's good, but I think it really detracted from the overall impact of not only his character, but how severe his character motivations were. I never got the feeling that he was like the next Führer. Like if he were to take over for Hitler and change the course of history, that, I mean, yeah, things would have been horrible circumstantially, but I don't feel like he would have been like a very interesting character to kind of base all of that around. But all right, so Helena, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, right? Something like that. I don't know this actress. I've heard about Fleabag, but I never watched it. And yes, I have watched all the stuff before I went into this. My wife was like, you were just primed not to like it because, you know, of all your YouTubing. And she's not wrong. I was definitely went in with an inexorable bias, not just because I didn't like Crystal Skull, but because I did watch a bunch of reviews and spoiler reviews and stuff. So I knew everything was going to happen. But here's the thing. I don't go into movies to hate watch them. I don't think I ever have. Why would I, like I said early on, like why would I spend my time and money, my precious time and money, precious, to waste my time like that? No. I still went in with an open mind. There have been plenty of times where I've seen something where everybody hated it. And I've been meaning to do an episode about this too. Movies where it's like universally hated, and I saw it and I was like, are we watching the same movie? So like, for instance, the Cloverfield Paradox, I mean, that was just universally panned. Everybody hated that movie. I didn't think it was amazing, but it was fine. Like, I followed it just fine. I thought the characters were fine. It was engaging. It was more engaging than Dial of Destiny. I don't understand. Like, there's this bandwagon thing where everybody has decided for everybody else how they should feel about it, and then you're wrong. Or another one was Passengers with J-Law and Chris Pratt. Just universally, everybody was like, don't see this movie, don't waste your time. I thought it was fine. And I saw it again, and I liked it even better the next time. Like, again, it wasn't mind-blowing, but it was, like, totally watchable and interesting, and it had a lot more to do and say than, like, any recent Star Wars content, sans Andor, and I'll get to that one on this show soon, too. Or this so-called Indiana Jones movie. So, yeah, even though I heard mixed to negative things about this, I still went in hoping at the very least to just enjoy it, that it would be an entertaining time. And that's what bothered me the most. I think if I was apathetic towards it, I wouldn't have made this episode. If it had just kind of come and gone and was like, okay, or if it was like really, really just bad, you know, like a lot of stuff in Crystal Skull was, that was more of what I expected. But this, like I said earlier, was just such a huge missed opportunity in so many different ways. That's what really bothered me the most about it. And that's why I wanted to talk more about it, because I had so many thoughts as I was watching it and later about like, well, why didn't they just do this? Or why did they add this without doing anything with it and all that kind of stuff? So Helena is a perfect example of that. I went in not expecting to enjoy her character very much, but I was also expecting that a lot of what was being said was hyperbole, because that's the internet. And I don't think that she was like the worst or most insulting thing I've ever seen. I mean, in a lot of ways, she to me was more interesting than like Rey in Star Wars, for instance. But that's just on a character level. Like on an entertainment level, I could not stand her. And I don't know if it was the actress and or the writing or the, you know, the acting or the performance aside from the writing, but it was probably all of it together. But pretty much any time she said anything, like just her expression, her body language, and how incredibly condescending and pretentious and dismissive she was of everybody, but especially Indy, was so annoying. I could not stand. And I felt her to be not just greedy, not just selfish, you know, which are not always the most desirable character traits anyway, but I also found her to be really like just despicably manipulative, you know, because she obviously had the capability of acting like a nice, kind, caring person when she wanted to. She played Indy from the beginning, and she acted all interested in him and their relationship and his work. So she was very aware, almost like, I don't want to call her a sociopath, but there was some definite like narcissistic stuff going on there with at least just the writing of her character, but also the performance that just made her really unlikable for me. And you can have a rough around the edges character, like for instance, it's Elsa, right, in The Last Crusade. She is a bad guy, but man, she is a really likable character. Like, she's very entertaining, fun to watch. And I like the idea that, as opposed to Marion in Raiders, or what's her name in Miss Screechy in Temple of Doom, even though they were, romantic interests, and they had some antagonistic qualities towards Indy, they were essentially kind of sidekicks. So I like the idea that Phoebe Waller-Bridge's character was more of an antagonist for most of the movie. On paper, I like that idea that she was kind of working against him, but they needed the kind of like reluctant pairing thing works great, with like buddy cop stuff and adventure and, all sorts of iterations. But she was just so incredibly unlikable. I just didn't want to spend time with her. And that's the thing about characters in stories. Even if they're not good people, like see The Shield for perfect examples of this, but if you want to spend time with them, you've made an engaging story with engaging characters. But Helena, I wanted her to go away. I just didn't want, and of course, she was like pretty much 50% or more focus of the movie. Ugh. Thank God she wasn't in the beginning. And the thing about it is, this comes to what I would have done in my draft is pretty much have the same character with the same characterizations, but she needed to be fleshed out more. Yes, she could totally be resentful and motivated by her resentment of Indy, being part of her dad's life for a period and then absconding and basically ignoring her. Though, she obviously is well educated and trained. She was like a superhero. Where did all that happen? And how did Indy not know about any of that? Like, as she grew into adulthood, why shouldn't she seek him out? Especially if he was her godfather. She knew that he had a son and a wife. Like, was it his responsibility to go find her as an adult? Was there any reciprocation there? I don't remember at what point in her life that her father died, but I don't think it was when she was 12, which is the last time was when we saw her in that flashback. So that didn't quite work for me. I understood at a character level where she was coming from. She was frustrated with him and didn't feel any kinship with him. Fine. Keep that. But her meanness and her condescendingness was totally unnecessary. And that's where I actually have a little bit of a softer side for Ray now, seeing this character. And obviously I'm going to compare the two because they're both under like Kathleen Kennedy's puppeteering to some degree. At least Ray was like generally nice to people. Not to Luke, but Luke wasn't nice to her. So there was a back and forth there. Indy started out trying to help her, and she was never on his side until later. And then, so that was the other thing that I would change, is clarifying her character motivation more than just, this is where my wife was coming from. She felt that it was implied enough that Helena's character was really a good person, but it was just buried underneath all of this, this lifetime of survival instincts and, having to manipulate people to survive, and not just physically, but also emotionally because of, her traumatic past and stuff. But where that broke down for me was that she kept going back to this greedy side of herself, where she was always, even towards the end, she kept saying that all she believed in was cold hard cash. And that really seemed to be the only thing that was like internally motivating her to do all of this. Obviously, she didn't want to use the dial, so there was nothing interesting going on there. She wasn't trying to help Indy clear his name, even when they were getting down to, like, you know, the dangerous situations, the cart chase in Tangier and the scuba diving part. When she saved him and everything, it wasn't out of any kind of camaraderie or kindness that I could tell. So by the end, when she was so fervent about bringing him back, I was like, why? And did she have any relationship with Marion? They never explained that. That was all, to me, so arbitrary and thrown together that she kind of contrived a reason for Indy to go back. But why did it matter so much to her? There was something missing there. There was a piece of humanity. If I was in charge of that, I would not have casted that actress because I didn't like her in the role. I don't have anything against her as an actress because I've only seen her in this, but I didn't think that she fit the role very well because she did have sort of a femme fatale thing going too with, you know, she was very self-sufficient and put together and she was using men, you know, and things like that. But she came across as more of like a hipster to me than like a femme fatale. So I don't know. It was all just kind of mucky with the intentions behind that. But then on the other side of it too, going back to Teddy, that was an interesting thing that they implied there, that, like she said, he tried to pickpocket her and neither of them would let go, so they've just been together ever since. So that shows that humanizes her, that shows that she has compassion and she is in need of companionship. But again, they don't do anything with it beyond just what we see is what we get. She just cares about Teddy, but he doesn't challenge her at all, and really kind of vice versa, just like Teddy doesn't challenge Indy or vice versa. And I never really felt like there was any real dynamic, any tangible or interesting dynamic between Indy and Helena that we could sink our teeth into. He actually seemed a lot more fond of her as the movie went on, but I didn't really understand why, because she was never giving him much to go on. She was just constantly condescending and over-explaining, you know, and taking the wind out of his sails, saving him, questioning him, belittling him, sometimes berating him, rolling her eyes. It didn't all come together. And that's also where I feel like if they had gone back in time earlier, if they had to do the time thing, they could have given their relationship a little bit more time to breathe instead of jumping to all these action set pieces that just didn't really have any character dynamicism to them. It was just kind of like on to the next plot point, on to the next set piece, on to the next action sequence. Nobody was really growing or anything. I mean, there was even that moment that I thought something interesting was going to happen where she was being sort of a casual, crass, overly lighthearted after they escaped the scuba situation. And Indy's like, you know, several of my really good friends just died. Could you give us a minute, you know? And she's just kind of like, oh yeah, sorry. That was, you know, for any humanity that they tried to imbue her with by these implied relationships or motivations that she had, to me, like, that moment killed all of them. Okay, and then this all leads me to my last big thing, which is the thematic content. What was all of this all about? To me, what really makes a story lasting, pertinent, what makes it matter, is what it's really about at its core. And sometimes it doesn't have to be deep. It doesn't have to be convoluted. It doesn't have to be ambiguous, you know, or pretentious. It can just be a clear theme. One of my favorite movies of all time that I've already mentioned today is Tommy Boy. Tommy Boy has very standard thematic content. It's about dealing with loss, overcoming, finding, you know, new companionship, new friendship, integrating that loss into who you are, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's like basic character growth all told through situational character comedy and sometimes like over the top characters and some slapstick. But in the end, like, there's still some heart to it. It still means something. The other Indiana Jones movies weren't that deep, and they weren't meant to be. You know, they're pulp fiction. They're reflective of a different time of storytelling where you had these larger-than-life heroes that were adventurers, and, you know, they would ride off into the jungle or the desert or the ocean, sword in hand, just ready to take on whatever challenges came their way. They were all about perseverance and passion and big picture stuff. So like in Raiders, there's not a lot of deep themes to it. It's, you know, don't meddle. Temple of Doom is kind of the same thing. It's like, don't mess with the equilibrium of things. Don't steal. Don't do forced child labor. And the third one, you know, gets a little deeper with, there's meddling and there's the hubris, you know, like there was in Raiders, but there's also a little bit more like undertones of family relations and being there for each other and, you know, the things you miss out on when you're not, etc. And I guess even Crystal Skull had something, you know, there was something going on with Mutt and him reconnecting with Marion. But in Dial of Destiny, other than the same tired, trodden, like, don't meddle with things you don't understand because there'll be bad consequences kind of stuff. And then, of course, you know, they scratch the surface with, like, Indy and his relationships. When it came to the climax especially, because the climax is where everything's supposed to come together, right? It's where the characters face their foes, whatever their internal, external foes, and they either overcome or they don't. It's a comedy or a tragedy. That's like the basic Aristotle way to look at it, right? And that's a totally appropriate lens to look at something like Indiana Jones through. It was never meant to be super deep and dark or, you know, get into like the shadow of humanity and the human condition and existence and everything. It's not existential, really. It's just good versus bad, power versus weakness, you know, those kind of basic things like Star Wars. And yet, when it all kind of came down to it, it felt like they were trying to rush some kind of thematic content, some kind of emotional beat there when Indy wanted to stay and Helena wanted him to leave. What were they trying to say? After all the trials and tribulations that those characters went through individually and together, and then they were thrust into this final climactic situation where there was Roman war raging around them and they were, you know, in the wrong time and Nazis and like all this stuff going on, and Indy felt like he might have had a place there. What were they really trying to say with all that? Like, and the fact that she had to take him away forcefully from where he felt he wanted or needed to be, like what his whole life had led to. How did she know that Marion was going to take him back or even take her call? Like, it was all so assumptive and abstract when it came to what the story was really about. Like, that begs the question for me is, why did this story need to be told? And I think that's a big issue with a lot of modern Hollywood, and especially franchise stuff, is why does the story need to be told? It doesn't. We're just trying to keep the franchise alive, the IP and the brand alive, so it'll keep making money. And, you know, I get that. It is what it is, but when I'm looking at it from the more, you know, artistic, expressive side, because this is art, it's a assembly line art in some ways, but there are dozens and hundreds of people that are artists and crafters that make this stuff come to life. Beyond just the economic, when you're telling a story, there's got to be a story to tell. And this just did not feel like a story that needed to be told, or really that was ready to be told. I didn't understand or really care what all the different aspects of the story coalescing together, from character to plot to genre to all the other aspects. What was it really about? What was it trying to say? I'd really like to know if somebody has a good analysis of it or an idea. Please find me and the show notes page and my socials and my YouTube and everything at breathingunderwater.us, where you can drop me a line, interact with me, leave comments on wherever you're most active, because I'd really like to know what you think. Does this story have a point that I missed? Was I too distracted by the flaws and the nitty-gritty and the details to miss like the big picture? I'd love to know what you thought about it and how you would have fixed these things. But for this last one, for me, how I would have fixed what it all meant, going back to what I said early on, I would have given Indy a more active and substantial motivation to be involved in these events with the Archimedes dial and everything. And that motivation having some kind of fatal flaw to it, that if he did have to go back in time because of the snowball effect of the film, that would have actually taught him something about what he was missing or what he needed back in his time. That he wasn't a dinosaur, that he wasn't out of touch and out of date, out of value, that he still had something to offer. And even if it was just reconnecting with Marion, if that could have been like the emotional core. But all they did, there were like 3 mentions of it in the whole movie. There was the divorce papers at the beginning. There was his total exposition to the audience dump in the middle, where he just explained everything that happened off screen with Mutt and him and his marriage. And then there was the end when Phoebe Waller-Bridge brought her to him. He was not active in any of that. So I know a lot of people say that ending was very touching, and it was a sweet little callback, but as a whole movie, especially because it was supposed to be sort of a climax to all these other movies, not plot-wise, but character-wise at least, to kind of give a send-off to Indy, I would have made the Marion thing a lot more substantial and upfront and important and a through line. If she wasn't going to be there in the whole movie like she was in Crystal Skull, at least make her lack of being there a really important part of the story and his character motivation, so that when it all came down to it and he's put in this crazy, wacky time travel situation, that he finally learns his lesson about what he'd been missing the whole time. And again, there was more there to play with too, because he had his goddaughter was back in his life, and his goddaughter came with a younger kid. So he had a new opportunity for like a found family, which they did imply at the end. They were all in that apartment together. Who knows if they were all going to stay together, if that's what they were even implying, but they just kind of shoved that all in at the end. And Indy, I never got the sense that Indy really felt it all and it really mattered to him, that it was a big part of his character. He just woke up all surprised. Everything had been done for him, and then he was like, all right, I guess this is how things are now. It just did not congeal, I think, the way that they wanted it to. And I really think it would have just taken a few more drafts of that script. Could have been something maybe not incredible, maybe not super special, but at least could have been a respectful, heartfelt, and at the very least entertaining send-off to one of the most beloved characters in media. So again, this is Dan. You can find me at breathingunderwater.us. I think I've rambled on long enough. I will see you on the next one.